who is a French queer feminist, she founded a French queer feminist NGO called Spectrum. She's actually Iranian. She's asked me to tell you, slightly tired and jet lagged, so please be kind, please be generous.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, I'm jet lagged. I'm very tired, but I'm super excited and really happy to be here. Thank you very much for having me also in this Sunday evening. Not that the weather is that nice, but it's London. Thank you for the introduction. I would maybe introduce myself better, or a bit more. Not better. Yeah. Let's say I'm an Iranian, queer, feminist, bisexual, woman of color, immigrant, living in France. That makes a lot of things, but that's not all of what I am. As a matter of fact, all of us do hold an intersection and intersections of identities, of different identities, and each identity happens to be a box. Last night, I arrived at the hotel like around 1 a.m. And I actually come from a conference with a lot of unicorns, LGBTQIA plus people, and no one asks you about gender there, and we have the pronouns, and we have to respect the pronouns really, really fully. And the hotel reception didn't even ask me what my gender was and what my pronoun was. And of course, they didn't ask me if I was a feminist, if I was bisexual, if I was a person of color. They just assumed that I was a woman, and they called me Mrs. Rad. Apparently, I don't know how they felt like they had to call me Mrs. Rad. Well, gender is the easiest box to put us in, right? Like, I look at you, and then I assume there are, okay, 4 men there, if they have some hair here, and like 5 women if they have longer hair. Where does it come from? I don't want to really go deep in that, but that comes really from our heteronormative society, the culture, which is all around the globe. Anywhere in this world I have been traveling, no one asked me what my gender was, unless I go in conferences where there is this assumption that people can ask you what your pronouns are. And that is not my preferred pronoun. That is my pronoun that I use. These gender assumptions come not only in pronouns, but they come also with a list of discriminations and privileges. Please, if you're a cisgender man, straight man, white man, I don't want to make you feel guilty. I just want you to please acknowledge your privileges and then use them to create a better world. So what happens on the internet? Of course, on the internet, I should have the choice to say if I'm a miss, a Mrs., or I just don't want to be called. I'm Soudeh. I identify as a human being, and who cares what my gender is when I'm taking a train seat or something? That was what we were talking for like 2 years in France, to stop people asking us if you're mademoiselle or madame. Seriously, what does it have to do with SNCF, the train guy or woman, if I'm married or not, if I'm available to be married or not? And that comes a lot in the feminist movement, battles, etc., etc. But how does that being reflected on the internet? So basically, internet came in. I'm 30 years old soon. And I remember a time we didn't have internet. I was maybe under 13 years old. The first time I knew there was such thing as internet that I could have access to, I was around 14, 15 years old. And I was privileged to live in a country where I could have access to internet. Well, I should say that on internet, it's not any better. Basically, what happens, not only that space is reflecting and mirroring the sexist societies we are living in, but also sometimes it's even worse. The first time I was alert about my privacy on internet was about 15 years ago, when my ex-husband, who happened to be an abusive man, emailed me. And that email address did not contain my family name. It was Soudeh _ something, 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 at yahoo.com, I'm sorry. And then I was like, oh, he can still find me. And I had changed my life, my whole life. I had moved out of that country we used to live in. But there should be some ways I could protect myself. So the first thing I did, that wouldn't surprise you, I tried to hide myself. I had a total another email address. I started to blog under other names, etc., etc. But the person I am, I couldn't take it anymore. So I started to speak out and tell who I am, tell everyone who I am, and that not to be afraid to say, yeah, I was a victim, a survivor, someone who has experienced abusive relationships and domestic violence. Well, and after 15 years, I see that that person who happens, again, to be a Cisco engineer is hiding himself. Who cares? Then I knew that many people like me who are identified as women, which society is giving them this identity of being the woman as a social group, are suffering from the same thing. We cannot really understand what you geeky people are telling us. Encryption, what is it? Oh, that's too much. Maybe I should just go take care of my children before I go to the next level. Just imagine one day on Facebook, you feel good, it's a Sunday evening, and you actually feel like you're a hero because you have survived an experience of rape. You're scrolling your Facebook, and there is a suggestion of a friend. Would you like to be a friend with the rapist? Well, no. And that can crush you. Or just imagine you're not a straight adolescent and you're just trying to understand this world of sexuality. I mean, straight people do not have to test their sexuality to see how straight they are, but this has been told to us that gay people, bisexual people, lesbian people have to test their sexuality. And the best place to test their sexuality to make sure they really are part of this minority, which is not minority, is to go on dating apps. Well, if your family is still LGBT phobic, if they see your application on your iPhone, what happens next? Not in London, not in England, but in some countries like Iran, like Lebanon, like Egypt, etc., etc. Or just imagine a sex worker who just wants to change their job. Well, no chance. Absolutely no chance. And what I do basically is that I do translations. What I do is I come here and I speak about those people who I'm working with, and then when I go there, in the feminist or queer groups, then I will start to talk about digital security, which I call digital hygiene, so that we can understand each other's languages. So privacy is not only about if you want to make sure everything's perfect, you're just going to close your door and then 100 locks. It's also about understanding why you need privacy and understanding also that you have a body and you have a life and you also have a right to privacy. It was only some years ago, I think 3 or 4 years ago, that I realized among my Iranian friends, not friends, also my contacts on Facebook or Telegram or Instagram, there are lots and lots of women whose profile pictures is actually not their faces, but flowers, teddy bears, themselves with their children, etc., etc. And I was just like, no, women, you have to put your face out there. While we're struggling in places like France about not covering women's faces, this is exactly happening on the internet. Well, the question was there, and then I started to talk to some of them one-to-one, and one of them happened to be one of my very best friends. And she said, no, you're getting it wrong. I'm protecting my privacy. Because if I show my face, people are going to assume I'm there to flirt with. So this is the culture we are living in, the internet. And if we want to change it, we need to change it all together. And when I say all together, it is all together. How many times have you seen a woman being trolled on the internet? How many times have someone just changed their identities on Facebook, changed their name, and you didn't know why? Have we asked them what has happened? How many exhausted people of this social media have we met? So, next time, please, if you're a man, and if you see a man trolling a woman, do not say, I'm not like them. Instead of that, please be an ally for what you believe in. Please do speak up. Please stop them. It's okay if you're not like them, because you shouldn't be. But that person is also a victim of this rape culture. So, I don't want to keep it very long, but when it comes to these places, when we create hashtags, like 10 hashtags a day, and we just keep updating the hashtags and hashtags, I would also call you and invite you to think twice, even more, about the hashtags we are creating and using on the internet. I remind you of revenge porn, which is not a revenge and is not porn. Still, it does exist. It usually happens when a woman says no to a man, and then there is a heart broken, and there is a revenge coming, and it comes with porn. If we want to change the rape culture in the internet, we need to promote and act with consent to get to a consent culture. And this is, I invite all of us to be really taken care of. I invite all of us to think inclusive, because thinking exclusive is actually very, very much difficult. I mean, more difficult than just excluding some people and say, okay, this product is only for these people. This product is only for that people. This is a question. I actually was I was the product owner of Hamdan, which is the only Iranian period tracker so far. It's been developed like 14 months ago, and so far we have more than 260,000 users inside the country, and that was developed only for Android users. For me, my understanding was, okay, I'm going to use the period tracker as a marketing product so I can raise awareness about the women's rights, equality, domestic violence, etc., me being the queer feminist. And then, ever since, I'm struggling to find funds to develop the iPhone users version. Why? Because there is no understanding of this is not technology, this is about human rights. So if you're developing some codes, if you're a coder, please think of the users. Please think who's going to use it on the other side. If you're just asking people for their gender because you want to have a beautiful infographic of the gender of people who are using it, remember, there's not only 2 genders, and there is not 100 genders either. There's more than that. So please ask yourself if you need to know the gender of the people and what that data is going to give you back. Is it because you want to put it in a pink or blue? Or what is exactly the aim of using that indicator? Also, please do remember that having invited women, people of color, etc., in your events or having them as coders, it's not enough. Those people, like me, need to be heard, need to be listened to, and need to be part of the project itself. They need to be decision makers. They just do not need to be there to be there. I think I should stop here so you can ask me more questions. And thank you very much. I really didn't want it to be a lecture.
Thank you, Soudeh. You're familiar with the drill by now. There's someone with a mic. Sorry, I probably shouldn't stand next to the speaker. There's someone with a mic, and there's a hand over there.
Hello, yeah. I'm thinking about a situation, you're walking along a street in the night and there's a group of people coming towards you. It's 5 women, or the other way it's 5 men. Isn't this a situation where you feel different about the gender? Or you could feel different?
Should I answer one more one? Mm-hmm. Well, that's exactly one of the examples of rape culture. It's not only about rape. It's where men expect women to be there as products for them, and then sexism is basically normalized. This is the very question people usually ask. Yeah, I was walking at this time in this street, and someone harassed me. What were you wearing? What were you doing that time? Why were you there? You should know this. You should stop wearing those kind of clothes, etc., etc. That is part of the rape culture, and I would invite you to go read more about it. And of course, the word is really heavy because the lived experience as someone who has the lived experience of a woman is really heavy. And that's why we want to move from rape culture to consent culture. And yes, of course, even me, myself, I'm aware that a man could just harass me with a higher chance than a woman would. But my understanding of gender is not only about the physical appearance. It does go even farther than that. I don't know if I could answer fully your question.
I have a question. So over the last day and a half, we've heard about how technology and the internet in various ways embed power structures and can have detrimental effects on minorities of all sorts. Sexual minorities, people of color, just generally poor people around the world whose national bodies may not be as robust as some other countries. Are there alliances or groupings of these various affected groups that get together to take on these power structures?
Well, to be honest, there should be many of them, but again, they do remain so-called marginalized because they're not in the center of production, basically. They're always being thought of at the second stage. That's true. And then also it depends on how many intersectional identities you're holding, so you can be part of that community. Like in Iran, I'm not considered as a person of color. It's only in France that I'm considered a person of color, right? Or maybe in a very like heteronormative society, I'm not considered minority because I'm a bisexual woman, let's say. It really depends where you are and what part of your identity you're expressing and what part of it you're oppressing. But of course there are alliances, and of course among us there are many people who are who are thinking about this inclusion and being inclusive, but there's so much of work to be done, so much of work to be done. Well, for instance, I'm just coming from ILGA Europe's conference, and then we had this digital hygiene workshop, and people were amazed how they were not even using the privacy filters on their phones. And they were like, we didn't even know that exists. And you know how that can change people's lives? That's amazing how that can change. And then we start to talk about the encryption, et cetera, and which makes people's lives even harder. And they also, many people, many of these minorities, I don't like the word minorities, but they're really put in margins, or let's say underrepresented people, they do not have access to information, and they do not know such things exist actually. And they're also living in a numbness situation. Like a bisexual person in Iran, they think like the Iranian government knows everything. So what? I'm going to just use these dating apps. And they basically are using the features of the dating apps, like geographic features, the picture, etc., and they're putting themselves in danger. Not that something is going to happen tomorrow. We don't want to scare them. We really want to give people the choice of their privacies. Like, okay, you have not been taking care of this part of your privacy, know that these are the dangers you might risk, be prepared for that.
There's a question over there.
Thank you. I'm really curious about this idea that identity is contextual, right? So in France, you're a person of color, but in Iran, you're not. How does that fit into a world like, say, online, where the things that we build don't necessarily have borders? And so how do we think about identity in different spaces if they're going to be translated into different contexts? Mm-hmm.
To say that, I can identify myself as anything. Like, I can identify myself as a unicorn, and that's not a joke, okay? But it depends, like, if other people are seeing me as that identity. No one asked me here what my pronouns were, but people assume that I'm a woman. So do I identify myself as a woman? Well, I can say yes or no at the same time, actually. Or is it that the society is reflecting or not? Well, yeah, in Iran, I'm considered a white person because I was born in Tehran and I come from that like central region. But those people in margins, like Kurdish people or Arab people, they are considered, as I say, people of color. When it comes to like social media or internet, everyone has millions of choices to assume or to identify themselves with, but I think any identity I take, it comes in a package of privileges, but also discriminations. So if I'm going out as a feminist, as a queer feminist, if I'm tweeting something, I should be ready to react. I should be ready for the trolls, etc., so I can defend this part of my identity, whatever idea I have, just put out there. I have no solution for that. The only solution is that we can do it all together. And if there is any change to be made, it can only be made together. It can only happen with every single one of us going one step forward together and actually listen to each other. It's good that I'm coming here, I'm telling you who I am, but more than that, I should be ready to sit here and listen to you so you tell me who you are. And then we can find these bridges, and every one of us should be, and I would really love that every one of us could be a bridge of different identities we are holding, so we could all together have a better understanding of the world we're living in, and stop just having these stereotypes about gender, countries, I don't know, companies, etc., etc.
Right, we have time for one more question before we move on to the final panel. All right. Well, in that case, Soudeh, thank you.
There's one question.
Sorry, just wait.
Hi. Thank you very much. Very interesting talk, and you're doing such important work, and it's great that there are people out there doing it. I have a bit of a provocative one for you towards the end. Do you think that having all of these identities and making them visible helps us recognize diversity or creates more boxes and labels to attach to people that they have to carry with them for the rest of their life and perhaps will have difficulty leaving behind at some point? Thank you.
Of course, that's a very question we get as queer people and feminist people. When we say, yeah, feminism is about gender equality, then they say, okay, then why are you talking about women only and not men only? As a matter of fact, we're all born human and equal and free, but this is not the ideal world we're living in. And until we get there, we need to talk more and more about labels, and those labels are not only labels, they're only about, not only, but they're also reflecting the underrepresentation and the identities we tend to forget. And until we get there, we need these flags, we need these different boxes, knowing that moving from one box to the other is absolutely free, and everyone can move and everyone can just identify themselves one day something and the other day something else, and there should be no discrimination. Until we get there, we need these labels and boxes, but the boxes are not really that boxes, they're really just some tick points.
It's kind of like identity portability.
Yes, we call it an identity wheel. We call it an identity wheel, so I would invite you maybe to go search for it, and then in that identity wheel you're holding every day, you can have different portions, and then you can use one of portions one day more or less. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Soudeh.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
All right, so that's this is our last chat for the day, and indeed for MozFest this year. With me, I have Mitchell Baker, co-founder and chairwoman of the Mozilla project. What we're going to do is we're going to go over some of the themes of the conversations we've been having over the past 2 days, and try and carry them forward, look forward. Before we do that, though, I just would like everyone to acknowledge Kevin Zawaki, who's hiding in that corner over there, who's responsible for putting this program together and inviting all of these speakers, coming up with the talks, and I think has done an absolutely spectacular job at the diversity, both of ideas and of people who've been up here today. Mitchell, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
So we discussed in the lunch break, since I think there have been several people here actually who've been for every single session, panel, talk. But I know for a fact I've been here, so.
I hope so.
You asked me to identify some of the themes. And I think what we've had a lot of over the past couple of days is diagnosis. I think we've diagnosed a number of problems in the information society in which we live, and I'll tell you what I think those are. And if anybody wants to shout out ones I've forgotten, please go ahead. So the sort of running theme in all of this, quite openly named, is that Facebook and Google have too much power. That's been something that's come up in practically every talk and practically every panel. A second is sort of inadequate regulation, inadequate structures for competition. A third was, and this was more today than yesterday, but indeed actually both days, was the very narrow worldview of Silicon Valley. And the fourth, which Soudeh again referred to, was the embedding of power structures. Mm-hmm. And so that's the diagnosis. And the sort of tone of the debate, I thought, was, it was optimistic as well as pessimistic, but occasionally quite angry or quite worried or quite reactionary, which are things that worry me. What I'm hoping you can offer is, having diagnosed the problem, having issued a very grim prognosis, so I'm hoping you can offer some prescription.
Sure, let's have the answers. Okay, well, why don't I start, and then we'll see where it goes. I will probably, well, the prescription, sounds like there's an answer out there, or one answer that's really clear, where I think what is clearer to me is a path, rather than exactly, like what are the exact steps, or what is the exact destination look like. Because we do now have a fair amount of, or some understanding of what's happening. That's pretty recent. But actually understanding not just the advertising business model of the big platforms, but how content is being moved and how people are being manipulated is pretty recent. Mm-hmm. The last couple of years, I would say, and especially on the manipulating of societies, it's been the last couple of years. So we have a very early and incomplete understanding of some of the dangers of the forms of technology that we have. We have, but a beginning, certainly of angst, a beginning sense of regulation, and there are data protection regimes in a few places now. So pretty reasonable cadre of activists, of which I think MozFest is an interesting microcosm, but we're just a small group. So a large, and growing set of activists. And the piece that I think is not developed at all is, like, what are the role of technologists in making something different, and how do activists, citizens, consumers, both encourage choice? At the big level, we don't have it yet for a couple reasons. All the social media platforms are the big platforms. There's only a handful. You can't leave Facebook and go to WhatsApp or Instagram, right? So, or even the alternatives from China probably aren't going to be our privacy-focused, security, individual empowerment alternatives either. So at the big level, there's currently no alternatives. I don't actually think there will be an alternative to Facebook, or if there is, that it will be exactly the same thing and really successful. Now, I could be wrong. There is LibreOffice, for the Microsoft Office suites. Maybe it will, we'll start using it instead of Google. In one sense, Firefox was that, but not exactly. So but I do think that there are new things in the future. But it will be a long time, I think, before as citizens or consumers we have a choice of something that is as potentially rich as the big platforms today, where we can make one choice. I mean, that was the great thing about Firefox, is it covered everything. Right. You could leave IE and choose Firefox, and it affected a huge part of your world. So I think that is a long time coming, and I think it is not accurate or fair to consumers or citizens to suggest it's our job to fix things as individuals. But I do think part of the answer is the development and understanding of technologies that behave differently. And that those, when they occur, they're often really small, they may be niche, they may be pilots, They may be things that solve a little part of the problem. And it can be easy to just not bother. But those choices do send signals into the market. I mean, we're starting to see some at Mozilla. So for a decade, we've been saying privacy, privacy, security, security. And it hasn't changed consumer behavior. I think because it just sounded so abstract.
Exactly.
And so the conventional wisdom across the internet consumer product part of the world has been that consumers will not make a choice for privacy. Like you have to build a great product. If it happens to be better on privacy, nice. And so as consumers, we want to change that. But that's going to be a lot of small choices over time. I can fix this little problem or that problem, but we need some of that. And then I think I hear what you're saying about simplistic. That wasn't your word, but simplistic responses or angry responses.
Reactionary is the word.
Reactionary. Okay. Because I was going to say I think anger is appropriate. Now, what you do with it is another, like how you channel anger into something productive is really important. I'm not advocating just spontaneous expression of outrage, which is usually violent. So, but anger and the productive channeling of anger, I think, is important. And for those of us who live in societies that have, democratic voting, in theory, it should be a campaign issue. It's certainly not right now, and there are other things very high on the list. So I think that what we have as the activism now is yet another phase of how to translate that into the mainstream, and what are the activities that one could take based on that. And also, I think, a real encouragement, pushing, prodding of every technologist we know to be trying to do better. So for example, at Mozilla, we've made very formal commitments about being committed to technology that promotes critical thinking, or that promotes humane behavior and not addictive or violent behavior. And so that's now part of the canonical, what are we as technologists trying to build into product and put into the market. And so that is not enough, because that alone, we're not a commercial organization, so we're not trying to maximize every penny, and that business motive can push you anywhere. So it's not by any means enough. But if there isn't a set of technologists trying to build technology that's not addictive, that's humane, that allows you to really think about where something comes from, is it rational, that is not trying to promote outrage so you keep clicking, the world will be better, and we should be building that. And so I think that part of the conversation with technologists about what are you doing, does that enter into your work, is important. I mean, it should become a mainstream discussion. And then I think the regulatory piece is necessary, and it's so hard to get right. So cookies in Europe, like that was the first, before the GDPR, what was the effort to try and break up the advertising tracking surveillance system? Cookies, but it's just this notice now that it's just another thing that you have to click as, quote, consent.
Right.
So important effort on behalf of the EU to make a substantial change, but irrelevant. Like, as it turns out, learning irrelevant.
Possibly counterproductive.
Could be.
In that you're training people to just click things away.
Oh, well, yes, although we're plenty trained. The whole idea that we're consenting to terms of service is ridiculous. So there was, I don't know if it's true in Europe, there was is a concept in the US that there is a category of contracts with consumers that is just unacceptable. The word is awkward, it's unconscionable. And it was applied in the 60s to a kind of contract which kept people in financial entanglement forever. And they just ruled this kind of contract, yes, someone has agreed to it, but you can't enforce it.
Right.
By this ongoing monthly payment where essentially you're just stuck forever. So for example, end user agreements or terms of service of the type that we now click, maybe they should be, aspects of them should be unenforceable as a matter of public policy. Like, so for example, the GDPR, which is trying to balance, which is very hard, but it doesn't say you can't track people. Like that's too far or that's too much with the business models. And I think that's probably makes sense at this point. But we as citizens and consumers, what would that mean? Well, I think you might mean maybe Facebook would not be here. Like, that's not actually what a lot of consumers want right now. If it just disappeared, like there's a lot of life and economic value. So this question of what kind of regulation and what as a society we want, rational thought, but I think that the GDPR is putting a stake in the ground and saying, well, something's unacceptable. We tried with cookies. The surveillance economy, we tried. We thought that wasn't good, and we tried, and it didn't work. Like, here's another effort, and like we intend to keep trying. Like that's a really critical piece, and I don't know incrementally how far you can get with the interpretation of this practice, and is it really control, or what exactly does it mean for me to have control? Like that's a long process to figure out.
It's a long-term project. I'm really glad you mentioned economic value though, because I do worry, as I said in a previous panel, I do worry about throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And we do need to remember that these companies have actually done a lot of good for society and indeed have brought a lot of value to society, to all of us individually as well. But one of the things that I was thinking about the past 2 days is that we spent a lot of time talking about exactly this. We talked about the stuff that's happened over the past 2 years, or that people have realized over the past 2 years. I'm not convinced we're fully prepared for thinking about the future, because we're thinking about it very much in the terms of the past, which is natural, it's human. But is there a sort of more realistic way of thinking about the future, a way that is not shut it all down, it's terrifying, a way that is not all, well, innovation is going to happen, not deterministic, where you feel like you have no say in how things develop? Is there a sort of sensible middle ground we could adopt?
I don't know. I think the curve of technical change the slope may still be increasing, right? In the sense of things happening so fast that it's actually hard to know and understand. And so certainly there's a lot of change coming, but might actually be increasing. So I'm not sure how to get to a middle ground there. I'm not a believer that you can just stop it.
Right.
Like I don't even know how one would do that or what it would look like. And you can't globally. So I think that is happening. I think realistically that the degree of the surveillance state is still increasing and will increase over time, because we're just beginning to react against it. Like, it's got a momentum. So the curve may change, but it's not now. So it's a lot of work, I think, to get that curve to change. I do think that there is a large, again, you might not be surprised, a large role for technologists and the funding and supporting of lots of technical experiments. Like, what would it look like for me to have defensive technology or even offensive technology in the world that we live in? Like, I'm not sure you can on the Facebook platform, because they own it. But if you take, or some of the AI things that are aimed at you, like it's hard. But in terms of what are the tracking devices around us, who's tracking us, how do I know? And so we are trying to do some of that at Mozilla. But I think that there's a huge amount of experimentation and that those things need funding as well. And that we do see more and more countries, trying to have incubators and VC funds and, create a technology community in their environment, more attuned to a regional or some other set of issues than Silicon Valley might be. And yet, even those organizations don't typically fund social enterprises. They don't typically fund a broader range of people that might be engaged in technology. They might have inclusion programs, they might not, but very often it is the model of, you know, we want the young hotshot technologists and we want, you know, the best financial return, and we're not really interested in privacy, and oh wow, if it had a double bottom line, like why would we fund that? And so there are, I think that's an area where policymakers and funders could actually make a difference over time.
So I think we've skirted around this topic of, so what is the role of government here?
Well, that's probably a political science question, like with answers across the spectrum. But I think most would say protect its citizens.
But funding, encouraging things?
Oh, well, so protect your citizens. Actually, I was thinking on the regulatory side at first. So I think that there's, to me, it's obvious there's a role of government vis-a-vis technological advances, just like anything else. I mean, oil discovery, you know, is a technological advance, and you know, every industry, you know, cars, they're all, you know, government has some role in protecting citizens. So I think that's important. I think governments vary in the degree of investment in the kinds of future that you want. So it probably varies. I think most governments feel like they should be investing in the things that are important for their citizens. I mean, sometimes they invest in what keeps them in power. That's a different kind of thing. Yeah, and most governments invest in infrastructure, one way or another, so development programs and so on. So to me, this investment in a lot of governments are trying to invest in technology, but it's kind of importing the model of what success looks like. Mm-hmm. And so some aspect of success would be, sure, if your local tech scene is developing the next global platforms, good, great, right? But that's like replicating or moving or winning at the Silicon Valley model. And there is this, what is the set of smaller scale experiments that we can find and try and see if they scale that build something slightly different. So investing in social enterprise, and in fact, governments typically do this through regulated monopolies, which is you know, a model from the past of the, you know, the phone companies, right? They were all the early ones were national regulated, well, not all. But many of them, you know, in Europe became national regulated monopolies, or the way we do water. So that's one model. It's not the one that, you know, I think works best for the technology space right now, because it's just so, the scope of change is so fast. But so I'm not actually advocating, but to answer your question, most governments are trying to build roads and, you know, the old infrastructure, and so there's clearly some, you know, range for government engagement.
That brings me to my final point, which is something we haven't actually talked about over the last 2 days, but I thought it's something that we should be thinking about right now, which, you know, various thinkers had sort of been warning about this for years. But it does seem increasingly like the web is sort of diverging because of regulatory structures and other government interventions in different parts of the world. You have, well, the Chinese model is the Chinese model, which we're all familiar with. But even in the West, you have a sort of divergence at the moment between European regulation and American, and as a result, very often, as somebody who accesses the internet from inside the EU for the moment, I do not have access to certain websites in the States and indeed elsewhere. Is this also something that we should be thinking about as governments intervene, as regulators intervene?
Well, there's a lot sort of in that question, because I don't know what content you mean, but probably DRM protected kinds of things.
Not even. I mean, so that's one example. You're right. There's many ways of looking at this. I'm thinking of something much more basic, which is the LA Times website. I cannot access that because the LA Times says, oh, the company that owns it, wait, there's new, it doesn't matter. The point is, they haven't got around, even now in October 2018, they haven't got around to implementing GDPR compliance.
Oh, well. Yeah, so the sense of that, and they may not, right? Which is partly why I think that the regulation is trying to be in the middle somewhere and trying to negotiate and figure out what ownership actually means. But that's true everywhere. Like in theory, you cannot buy a car that would be cheaper if it didn't meet local safety regulations. You know, and some set of people could buy cars that can't today because, you know, if the tires were going to explode and the windshield was going to kill you, like it would be cheaper. So we you know, we make those decisions about every industry. You know, it's just that right now the internet, we're so accustomed to everything is free and available that we're not actually used to making that trade-off. So that will be an interesting choice, whether we really want it as citizens. I hope so, because safety, you can't make yourself safe on your own. Like as a society, you know, it has to be spread around. Yes, I think the internet is fragmenting, and my own view is it will fragment more. And so that's not the early, everything is the same everywhere. But we don't currently, you know, have global mechanisms for doing things. So I understand you want to get to the LA Times, but I think it has a paywall anyway. So like after by the third time, you'll have to pay for it. It's my experience. So anyway, so I think let's look at these in the context of other industries and see if tech is really different, and we don't want protection because we want it available all the time for free. I think the internet is fragmenting some, and I would question that in the IoT space. Maybe like I want an internet of sort for my home. Smart home things, but I don't really want that on the global internet.
Sure.
Why in the world do I want to participate in taking my private information and putting it in this system? Now, when you use one of the platforms, you have to, because that's the trade-off. So as I said, I'm not sure we'll see another Facebook that's like Facebook but different, but I think you know, there'll be some changes. But I think in the home and IoT and smart devices and voice, we could see something different. And coincidentally, that's where Mozilla is investing technical energy and time, is because we see there's an opportunity there. And so I hope that that's correct, because then we'll get enough consumer. You need, like, not only does the market bring economic value, but the power of a consumer when given choice to drive change it's really powerful. And so I am hoping that in some of these spaces where we don't yet currently have the one giant platform based on a surveillance business model, that not just Mozilla, but others who can offer something different, like we could get enough positive response to, you know, try and use that to drive proof of interest in privacy and security. Because we as consumers have not proved it yet. As citizens, the EU have, but as consumers, we have not. And partly we're not getting enough choice, right? And then when we have them, we have to make them.
Finally, because I realize we are out of time, and I'm sure lots of people have lots of questions. So finally, it's more of a plea than a question. Can you give us a reason to be optimistic?
Yeah.
Or several.
Yes. We've had, 20 years, let's say, of the internet. We tend, first of all, to forget how much value it's currently bringing on a day-to-day basis, because what's in front of us right now are the sudden realization of the risk and the damage. So first of all, there's a lot more value that we're still accruing than we actually emotionally feel, right? Also, if you look at how humans work. Like the danger in front of you is a lot more important than, a spread out value. And like we are just so early in understanding what's wrong and trying to fix it. So one of the things that makes me very hopeful is that the problems have had, a period of time to develop, and we're on like, I don't know, maybe we've been born, but maybe we're like a 3-week-old infant in trying to figure out, well, how do we fix them? And in realizing that the intersectionality of the problem in technical development, this view that technology is so magic. Like, in the early days, it was just this wonderful, powerful force, and because it was both different but seen so great, it lived outside of the rest of the world. It lived in a little tech bubble with no regulation and this belief among the technologists that, oh my God, we just get to do whatever we want and we're so great and everything we do is going to be good for the world. Even though it's just a very small group and that's not true, and many completely unbalanced and arrogant in approach. So like bursting that bubble and the sense that technology is humanity in action, and we need to pay attention to it like human nature, is so new that we don't even yet have tools. Like you can see lots of diagnosis, right? Like you need diagnosis before you can even start to test and build tools. And so the diagnosis piece is getting pretty rich. Like it's not complete, that's going to grow for a long time, but we're starting to understand the subfields and some of the intersectionality through the diagnosis. And so we're, I think, like just even coming up to beginning to build tools. And we don't have many yet. So I think that the power of the movement of people and our effectiveness at harvesting the good things out of the internet and finding ways to deal with the hatred and the violence and the misogyny and the racism and those things, like we haven't started yet. So I think there is a lot of power in that, and even the core, boy, I'm just so great technologists have realized there's a problem. There are some who still think they're great. I won't name them, but you might guess. But for many, like that realization, which fair critique to say you should have had it at the beginning, arrogance, like, US, whatever, fair critique. And even so, I'd say the set of technologists who are now like, oh, wow, okay, got to do better, it is growing. And we find, we aspire to be that at Mozilla. We're imperfect and flawed, and we have plenty of our own biases, and we're struggling to, change our org and, be inclusive on a range of vectors. So deeply flawed, but highly aspirational. And we find that the incoming comments from the industry are starting to shift tone. From, oh God, you're so cute. Right. Little nonprofit, run by a woman, you're just so cute. To like, oh God, like your message of the last decade was real and we just didn't hear it. So there are some signals there, and so I'm hopeful that as diagnosis gets richer, we start to have some tools, we start to see some signal from consumers and from citizens through their regulators and legislators that, the power of the let's build something decent and humane and powerful will grow.
Great. Mitchell, thank you very much. I'm sure there's lots of questions. We'll turn up the lights and we'll wander around. There's no questions. That's amazing. All right, there's one.
Hi, a lot of the work that I do is in political strategy. So when I was listening to you describe the current dynamics of the internet and internet politics, one thought that struck me as a possible prescription to the problem and also as a possible solution is that it seems that the internet as it exists now is very unipolar in the sense that Western society and Western countries, primarily the United States, tend to dominate on the global scale what the internet looks like, the products that tend to have mass appeal, and the tools that we build in the United States is what gets mass exported. So my question is it possible to see a future that is more multipolar on the internet, where you have more regionalism, where different countries and local tech scenes, in that sense, regional tech scenes, start building their own alternatives to Facebook, to a lot of these tools that have kind of gone mass global, and instead, can they self-regulate? They know the tools that they need and how to increase privacy that is relevant to them. Is that something that could happen, or is that, just like in politics, infeasible?
Well, so I think it could happen. I think there is an appeal to global. There are some benefits to being global. We don't actually have the answer. So if you wanted to build the most profitable thing possible, you might rebuild Facebook. Like, you might ban it from your country and rebuild it yourself. I mean, right? So yes, and on a regional level, you have to have a motivation, or you have to look at what the motivation would be. So if you're just trying to build a regional variant of something and or capture the revenue from it and make sure it doesn't go to, you might build exactly the same thing. But you might get more experiments, or it might be easier before the fact to set out what would be acceptable terms and conditions. So I think it's possible, but you might get more variance in it. Yeah.
Actually, we discussed this yesterday. Marcia was mentioning in Iran, they basically just built a local messenger app to replace the international one. Which is, as you say, it was just replicating what was already there and saying, oh, this time we're going to keep all the data instead of letting it flow outside our country.
Yes. Yes, and so we may see more, regulations of that sort. But then it is fragmented, and so depending on if and when your society would benefit from interacting beyond the borders, I mean, you're setting yourself up not to be able to do that.
Yeah.
Right. And so, like, some economies can do that, not many, right?
So at the very least, your data collection is regionalized rather than globalized.
Yes, your data collection might be regionalized, and depending on where you are, that could be better or worse for you. Right. And I would say it's interesting exactly what that will mean in practice, because where your data is stored, depending on what the legislation is, you might be unable to complete a transaction, right? Because the internet is not always within national or regional boundaries. And so depending on how much you want your data under your own, we'll say, national or regional law, you may not actually be able to do commerce. It's not really clear what that looks like. Maybe Amazon is big enough to have everything in Europe so you could buy from there, but the smaller one wouldn't. So there's a lot of consequences as you think about actually fragmenting further.
Go on.
Mitchell, we hear a lot about how we need to work to protect children online, that we need to create a box for them and keep the children in a box and make sure they're secure and whatnot. But yet we're now in a world where there's a generation that's coming up that has the internet is fundamental to them, and they've grown up with that. And I'm wondering how we can strike a balance between that protection and then at the same time exposing the internet to the children, like where the internet, we don't need to protect the internet from children. We may need to protect children from something that's on the internet now, but we actually need to find ways to bring in that youthful energy, that youthful creativity. And I'm wondering what ideas you have about how we as Mozilla and how we as an internet community can make that happen and enable the youth to really take control and shape that internet.
Well, so I'd start by saying I'm not like a lot of what I would call tech libertarians, in that young children, we try to protect young children from many things. And clearly the internet today is probably one of them. No, I mean, clearly the internet today is one of them. And so I think that you're talking about that transition phase when children begin to be able to make decisions that we think are healthy, and when and how do you allow that, which is one set of questions. But then I think the other one is how to get the creative energy of youth, whatever you mean. I don't know if you mean 12 or 18, 17 or whatever, into the process. And so for that, I would say there is something about creating and making and engaging that goes beyond clicking as a consumer. That's unfair. It goes beyond being a consumer. And so one of this is for the second question. And so one of the things I think is just fundamental is how many, all of us, but in particular young or youth, get both the excitement and the tools and the learning and the training to actually engage in making things. Because I hear over and over and over, oh, this generation, they're native, which is true. But what people mean is, what they really are saying is that young people are more comfortable with massive inputs. A set of headphones, music in the background, playing a game, doing homework. And it turns out, they're actually probably not. Like humanity has not changed that much in one generation. That the human brain is not set up for that. So the effectiveness is questionable, even though multiple inputs are there. For deep thinking. I mean, not for switchboard stuff. But what they're not actually looking at is, does this person understand what lies underneath the surface? And it turns out that's actually not age correlated. And 2 or 3 generations ago, when the web was new, we were actually pretty far along. So I think there's a learning in how to be both a knowledgeable consumer, but more than that, the remix line that Mark uses, or we use at MozFest. What's underneath it, and how can I get to it and make something that I want more? Because many people are still in the phase I call it the luxury of consumption, which the internet is great at, or the web is. It's there, it's free. I mean, if you can buy a phone and pay the data charges or pay your ISP, there's so much available that's just there instantly and it's free. And I think for those people who have experienced the luxury of consumption, which is just a small percentage of the population, but we're probably in it, then the luxury after that, is the luxury of creation. Because if you're solely a consumer, you get what someone made for you. And someone made it for you for a reason. And sometimes that reason is great. I mean, I like to think, Mozilla's reasons are great, but we make it for a reason. We make it to make it. But there are a lot of reasons that are not great. And a lot of this technology is so incredibly manipulative that I think teaching all of us, but you asked about youth, what makes it up, and how can we amend it to make it less addictive and manipulative, and get some joy into it, would be the right path.
So, okay, we'll take one last question, because we've already sort of basically doubled the amount of time allotted to us. So we'll take one last, at the back over there, one last question.
And then I'd like to make a very brief, closing comment, if I could. Okay.
I'll get off the stage.
Oh, no, not like that. Okay.
Here, if you want to see. I admire your position, your role, and your responsibilities you have taken for your role. And I have a question for you. We have talked about governments and other entities. I'm a bit more minded at low level, if you can say it that way. What people in their daily lives can do to tackle these questions for people like 9-5 jobs or not, or people that are a bit aware of these problems, but don't even know where to look for or who to contact, what little changes we can do in our lives, not only technologically, I mean, not only for the technology itself, something else. We have talked about programmed obsolescence, so multiple questions, multiple issues, multiple problems. It's fine to reply with some compromises on convenience. It's fine. I'd like to have a more original and genuine question as possible.
Okay, let's see if I can be original. Okay, so first of all, I think for most people living their lives, we can't make people feel too bad for not doing very much. I mean, like, a lot of people, like, paying the bills and, like, just getting through the month is difficult. So, one, I think supporting the regulators. Like, there's been this view with tech that, and it, you know, certainly the view of tech is that, you know, regulators are bureaucrats, they're all bad, they don't know anything, we know all the right stuff. Like, and that can be contagious, especially about, I think it was very effectively contagious. So regulation is tough, and it doesn't work well with tech. I mean, I agree with that. And society has to do something. So I think counteracting the narrative that only tech, you know, knows what's good for tech, like, is really important. You postulated that people don't know what to do, right? And so that's a tough one. Like, the answer from Mozilla is, in part, we try to make products that people want. So they're answering a different question of, like, oh, what helps me online? Let me do that. And then you are making a choice that's also good for the system. I think there's some, it's so local to society, how you get, like, tech issues to be relevant. But let's see if I've gotten enough in there. As a set of people, like, I think we have to find a few go-to places of what you can actually do. You know, at Mozilla, we try to have tips for those, but our reach is not as large as we'd like it to be. So I think there's some general movement of where do you go or where do you look. So that's an incomplete answer. I apologize.
Right, before you do your closing, I just want to say also that you guys have been amazing. You've sat here for 2 whole days listening to stuff about regulation, data protection, competition. These are not exactly the sexiest topics in the world. So thank you very much for turning out, asking lots of good questions, and being a great audience. Give yourselves a hand.
Yeah. So my last thought is very similar. It's a little broader. You know, my husband always says that I come back from MozFest totally jazzed, and that it's part of the invigorating cycle and the sort of the juice that keeps going when we live these issues every day. And so I want to thank everyone at MozFest, whether you were a denizen of this room or came or have been doing something else. It is amazingly invigorating, but also deeply gratifying to learn and meet the set of people engaged on this set of issues. And the work and the ideas that you bring to MozFest are really have been quite boggling. It's been quite a year for that. And so just to say how important each of you in the work that you're doing, because you're bringing it here, so we see it here, is, and how much it inspires all of us who are involved with MozFest. So thank you all. And you too.
Oh, hey everyone, before we depart, I wanted to give another quick thank you to a deserving few. The supremely talented AV team here, the Ravensbourne volunteers, and my colleague Steph McVicker, who have made sure everything is run smoothly here. And of course to Leo for lending us his curiosity and his wit for the last 2 days. So thanks very much.